Ever happened to Glenn Miller? Well, most of you probably who are watching this probably know the story. I used to do in the beginning of every March a program for a local radio station celebrating Glenn's birthday, and 60 years after his death, or 70 years after his death, we would still get all kinds of calls, and we'd get all kinds of letters and notes, and people would thank us and all that. And we did this for a number of years. And one day I was toward the end of that run. I was on the air, and we were chattering back and forth. And we took a phone call from the public, and guy gets on the phone and says, "You know what happened to Glenn Miller?" "Okay, what?" And he said, "I knew the MPs and military police after he was killed in a bordello in Paris." Okay. I tried my best to dissuade this gentleman from his belief that Glenn had died in a house of prostitution somewhere in Paris. But there has always been a mystery as to what happened to Glenn on December 15th, 1944. The Glenn Miller we know, or the Glenn Miller of history, of course, he had 17 #1 hits. He had 17 #1 hits faster than Elvis or the Beatles. He was, in his day, there was a period of time in 1940 where Glenn was the only person with a #1 hit in the United States from the beginning of February to mid-August. And so, if you stop to think about it, 6.5 months and being the only person at #1 on the charts gives you an indication of just how powerful a figure Glenn was in the music world, and of course in the popular culture world. And then the war came, and in 1942, toward the end of 1942, he volunteers for active service, and of course, has to go through boot camp and all that, but emerges as Captain Glenn Miller with what is known as the Army Air Force Band, which some believe, of course, is the greatest of all the big bands. It was more than a big band, though. It was a huge conglomeration of different musicians with different skills. And he took it overseas in 1944. In the summer of 1944, he took his band over to England. Up to that time, it had been used for Bond rallies and to keep up spirits and stuff like that. Released a number of records, basically just simply trying to sustain morale. But in England, Glenn was very unhappy. First off, he didn't like English food. And second off, he didn't like English weather. And third off, because of having to move all these musicians around in wartime with a limited number of vehicles available, they did a lot of flying. Now, Glenn had never done much flying, and he didn't despise it. He was terrified by it. And this weighed on his mind. He missed his wife, Helen. He had a son, Stevie, whom he had seen, and he had a daughter, Johnny, whom he had not seen. And by December of 1944, he'd been in England for about half a year at this point. There's a record of him saying that the government can have all his money, just take him home. He had had enough. And of course, what soldier doesn't feel that way? I mean, the famous Norman Rockwell painting, Coming Home, which I think pretty well captures it. Homecoming of the soldier home from the war. Well, that wasn't what was going to happen to Glenn. And essentially, something called the Battle of Bulge, which was a massive German attack, maybe the last good German attack that the Germans could mount in December of 1944. Battle of Bulge was a very, as they say, was a very close run thing. The Germans did quite a job. And Glenn was anxious to get his band over near the front line. And in fact, they will be near the front line. Glenn won't be with them, but you know, he's anxious to get his band over there. Glenn was a deep patriot. He had been born in a place called Clarinda, Iowa, or he grew up in a place called Clarinda, Iowa, and he you know, he was really a product of the country's midsection, a deeply patriotic and man with a bad temper, but a decent human being. You know, he wanted to go home. I don't much blame him. And so on December 13th, 14th, and 15th of 1944, the weather was just terrible. And Glenn you know, is desperate to get over there, more kind of a psychological thing, I think. But he wanted to be moving. And we have some diary entries by other people from that time. And it's pretty clear that Glenn was completely fidgety. You know, he didn't want to fly to Paris, but he wanted to get his band over to Paris. And he wanted to entertain the troops, but that was going to take flying. And of course, he's very upset about being away from Helen and Stevie and Johnny. And so, you know, the weather comes in, as they say, even the birds were walking. This was really typical English weather, or what we think of as English weather. And finally, a general essentially loans Glenn his pilot. So a fellow by the name of John Morgan. And Morgan was a hotshot pilot. I mean, this guy was a real thing. He could really fly. He had been on a number of really complicated and difficult missions. And, you know, there's a lot of faith in him. So Glenn and a couple other folks are there going to, you know, at this place that's called Trinwood's Farm. It's a airstrip near the English Channel. And you know, the clouds are just on top of them. And it doesn't look like anybody would fly anything in this kind of weather. So what essentially happens is you know, Glenn and his people are waiting on this airstrip, or next to this airstrip, waiting for this hotshot pilot to come in. He's flying a C-64 Norseman, which, you know, is not a very sizable plane at all. You can see this. I'm not 100% certain that I would want to fly any place under almost any weather condition in this plane. It was kind of a hotshot plane, single engine plane, you'll notice, and which bothered Glenn because Glenn had some bad incidents with airplanes, and he was particularly wary of single engine planes because if you lose your one engine, you're toast. Anyway, Glenn and another person, a colonel, and Morgan get aboard the plane, the C-64, and fly off. Now, what happens next is a matter of considerable, I don't know, a dispute might be the right term. Up until fairly recently, there was a belief that what happened was a bombing wing of the Royal Air Force was coming back, and they had been unable to find their targets and were coming back, and they found that, you know, because of fuel and weather, they had to jettison their bombs. And there's been a long time belief that what happened was that as this wing came over, and of course the C-64 is flying at a much lower altitude than these larger planes are, that they jettisoned their bombs and just by sheer bad luck hit Glenn's plane. That seems nowadays to be fairly unlikely. that, first off, the coincidence of that happening would just be fantastic. Strange things happen in wartime. I'll agree with that. But still, that this just simply seems unlikely at this point. The English Channel, it's not very broad, but having been there, I can tell you that the weather can be really amazing. And so, if Glenn is flying across, it's just not a great distance, but you got to make it across it. I mean, even if it's a short distance, you still have to make it across it. Ideas such as Glenn being killed in a brothel. Glenn was a pretty straight-laced guy. Seems unlikely that he would be killed in a brothel, particularly because the other two people in that plane never show up again either, which suggests that something happened to the plane. Well, what did happen to the plane? And the real answer to this is this. When Glenn took off at sometime on the afternoon of December 15th, 1944, it was 34 degrees at Twinwood Farms. That means that it's going to be 8 to 10 degrees colder over the English Channel. Well, guess what? The C-64 has no de-icing equipment. Now think about that. They got to make it across a body of water, and the effective temperature outside is going to be 26 degrees or 24 degrees or some such thing. Of course, they're even higher, so it's going to be colder than that. Well, what happened? Probably the carburetor iced up, and they went in, or the carburetor and the fuel lines iced up, and they went in. Given the height that C-64 would most likely have been flying out, the time between the engine quitting on them and making contact, which would have killed everybody instantly, was probably about 8 seconds. You don't even have time to think about what's just happened here. And so Glenn, almost certainly, if there's anything left of him, is resting at the bottom of the English Channel. I've seen people have gone up with detection devices or basically, if there's anything left of that plane at all, and remember, this is not a big plane, it would be the engine block. And even then, the engine block would be severely corroded by the salt water by this time. I doubt that there's anything left of it. But still, people have mounted expeditions trying to locate this tiny, tiny little plane that you saw earlier. Well, Glenn never made it back. The other two people never made it back. Helen Miller, until her death in 1964, kept a bed waiting for Glenn. Like many other people in wartime, she simply couldn't accept that her husband was gone. I had an aunt whose youngest son was on a warship in the Pacific. A Japanese bomb took the bottom out of it. And the plane was straight down, no chance of survival. But she spent many years waiting for him to come home. Well, that's what happened to Glenn Miller. And he left behind an incredible catalog of music. His influence on popular music. He is a bridge from the era of jazz, from the jazz age, up into the vocal period that we continue to be in, which instruments are less important as a rule than voices. And he was an incredibly bright, incredibly capable man. And that's what happens in wartime. Incredibly bright, incredibly capable people get killed too. Everybody out there, take care. Take care of yourselves. And above all, in this day and age, please stay healthy. You know, for those of you who like the videos that we do on this channel, I'm just going to ask you gently, if you could subscribe, you put a like on this, it helps us keep doing these things. You know. Well, Major Miller, what a sad day. Take care, everybody.